Today is September 25th, 2013, and I am interviewing Walter Sobel at the Wilmette Public Library in Wilmette, Illinois. Walter just celebrated his 100th birthday, having been born on July 25th, 1913 in Chicago, Illinois. My name is Jennifer Klein, and I will be the interviewer. Welcome, Walter. It's great to see you today. And my first question will be, how did you get into the Army? Tell me your story.
In about 1941, I was working as a project manager for the firm Albert Kahn. They were the premier industrial architects in the Detroit area. I had been introduced to them when about a year earlier I met the nephew of Mr. Kahn, and we had some interesting experiences, and then sometime later he said his uncle Albert Kahn was looking for project managers. Would I be interested in an interview? Not having worked in a large office, I thought that was a good idea. And I was given the project, the Ohio Steel Foundry in Lima, Ohio. That building was 50 feet wide and 700 feet long and very high. It was designed to provide a space for casting gun barrels for battleships, which the main turrets are approximately 20 feet long. So there was a large concrete space where the gun barrels were developed. But as happened many times, the Navy didn't need any more 14 and 16-inch guns. They now needed more anti-aircraft guns. So the pits were then much smaller. The contractor was given a change order, and his proposal was for casting a hole all of about a foot square pit, and did not provide any offset for that, what he had his original contract. When I received it, I showed it to my boss, who was Robert Linton, he said, don't worry about it. Just turn it over to the estimating department. They'll take care of it. A few days later, the secretary of our unit called me while I was in Lima and said, Mr. Khan wants to see you tomorrow morning, first thing. I asked her, well, what's it about? She said, well, the boss will tell you. I got in early and I talked to him, and I said, I explained it all to you. He said, yes, but Mr. Khan wants you to tell him. This was Mr. Lewis Khan. He was the brother of Albert Khan and the managing partner. So I took the papers and I went down to Mr. Lewis Khan's office, and I started to tell him, my name is Walter Sobel. He said, Sobel, I know who you are. Why haven't you signed these change orders? I said, Mr. Khan, I would like to explain why I have not doing it, why I have not do it. He said, I don't want any explanation. I want them signed. I said, Mr. Khan, if I can't explain it to you, I have to give them to you, and I suppose that terminates my position here. He said, you're right. Now that was on a Thursday, a Friday night. I usually went to Lima on Tuesday and Thursday, so I went back to, I explained to my roommates, one was an architect, the other was a mechanical engineer. The architect's name was Bud Schinderman, and Bud explained that he would like me to tell his date. We had gone in Chicago a couple of times to the Shapery, and his date was what became my future wife. And he said he would like me to tell his my future wife, Betty Debs, that he was now going to date a young lady in Detroit, and probably wouldn't be seeing her. And of course I explained to him that I thought I'd be crazy to do such a thing. And he argued and argued, and finally I said, well, okay. So another interesting coincidence. On the train going from Chicago to Detroit on Sunday night and coming back on Friday night, there was a fellow who had been a client. We designed the building, which is now Heckey's. And he'd been after me to join the Navy, and I kept explaining that if I could be in the civil engineering corps, that would be great. And as we were going back to Chicago, I said, I'm ready to go, but please get me into the civil engineering corps. That was Friday night, and on Monday shortly afternoon, he called and said, I've got you a commission. And I said, the civil engineering corps. He said, no, but we'll get you transferred. Now, my brother, Burton, was in the Navy. He'd been in the Naval ROTC at Northwestern, and in about 1941, they were called to active duty. I asked him if I could get transferred. He said it probably wouldn't happen, but if you committed to do the Navy, just do it. I talked it over with my father and mother. My mother was unhappy to have two sons in service, and my father said, if you think it's what you need to do, do it. Monday afternoon, this man's name was Tom White. His company had been White Building and Maintenance. And he, as I mentioned, we had designed this very simple building, which is on Emerson and Green Bay. And it's now Hecky's Barbecue. Well, Monday, shortly afternoon, he called and I said, I've got you a commission. You're to be in Princeton by next Sunday night. Now, in order to fulfill this request, I had to get examinations and uniforms, and anyway, I made it to Princeton on Sunday night. Princeton was a facility to train future officers to go aboard the small craft, like mine sweepers, mine layers, torpedo boats. It had never occurred to me that that was what was going to happen. Well, after we finished our education at Princeton, we then, by fate, about 24 of us were given orders to go to Ohio State to learn how to teach the topside personnel the fundamentals of recognition of ships and planes. In the landings in Africa, which had been earlier that year, we were shooting at our own planes. What happens was we had a professor who had developed a facility to project images of ships and planes, ours and the enemy's, in various positions. It's called attitudes. And when we finished that, we were assigned to battleships in the Pacific. The about two each for the battleship division called BAT-10 were assigned and was ordered to go to San Francisco, Treasure Island, where we would be given orders to go aboard the ships. They were at that point in Hawaii, and we got all of our gear on the ship, and that was one evening, and then we were ordered to take the equipment off and go back and wait to get transportation to Adak, Alaska, since the ships were going up to the Aleutians. About 2 weeks later, we went to we went aboard the USS Salt Lake City, which was a heavy cruiser and had been damaged in the operation on the Aleutians which were at Kiska and to I have to give something to break.
Okay, take a break. It's perfectly okay. Perfectly okay.
We were transported on the USS Salt Lake City to Adak, Alaska, which was a big harbor where many ships for the operation were assembled. When we got to Adak, the ships were on patrol, so we had to wait till they returned, which might be 2 to 3 weeks. I went to the engineering officer and asked him if he could use somebody who could do some drawings. He said, "Boy, can I. I only have fellas that can use a hammer, a wrench, etc." And he said, "I've got a great project for you. We need an officers club, and it's got a great location. It would have on the promontory. Now, the land in this space is about 30 feet above the water. So he took me out to that promontory. He said, "Now, the only limitation is that you have to use a Quonset hut. That's a big metal unit, about 25 feet wide and 20 feet high." And so I designed this officers club, and we have a picture here to include however
we
that
can
gets done.
put it up in front of the camera here and we'll take a look at it. Move it over this way a little. There you go. Oh, that's wonderful. And that's called a Quonset hut?
Okay.
Thank you.
As you noticed in the picture, I put dormers on the side to have daylight into the space, and put a big fireplace at one end. And I finished the drawing approximately when the ships returned from patrol. So we gave orders to go aboard, 2 of us to each ship. And I finished the drawings approximately when the ships returned. We went aboard the ships, and I was selected to be officer of the deck for general quarters, which meant that I was on the bridge with the captain and gunnery officer and a couple other quartermasters. When we returned from the patrol in about 3 weeks, as we entered the harbor, the officers' club was complete up on the promontory. Being on the bridge with the captain, I said, "Captain, could I invite you to have a drink when we get aboard, ashore?" And the captain said, "Well, that's a possibility." And we did do it. And then we went on patrol, and when we returned, again, there was time to have another possibility. So I went to the engineering officer, said, "Can I be of assistance now?" He said, "Great. We need a chapel, non-denominational." So I designed that chapel, and again, we went on patrol. And when we came back, it was complete. But I was given orders to go to Dutch Harbor and to learn how to teach the topside personnel to recognize this one, to learn how to operate the new device or new unit called LORAN, LORAN, long range navigation, particularly suitable in the Aleutians because there was very little sunlight, and mostly the sunlight was over the islands, but not over the water. That meant that there were markers which were identified in maps to position, to recognize the position of the ships in areas where there was no light, or even if there was. And when we came back, we were then ordered to participate in the landings, participate in the operation to take back the Sitka, Kiska, and Atu. They were the furthest west islands in the Aleutians, amazingly about 500 miles from the tip of Japan, which was amazing, especially to me. And that had been occupied in that battle just before we came aboard. So this was going to be a night operation to get the Japanese off that island. We fired so many rounds, but we never could see, of course, it was dark. But there were what was called radar blips that indicated that there was some activity. And when the troops went aboard the next day, there were no Japanese on the island. About several years later, my wife and I, Betty Davis became my wife. And we went up to Juneau, and I, at that time, was interested in designing courthouses. So I went to the judge, who was the chief judge of the court in Juneau, and explained my interest and my history with the Navy. He explained to me that he had written a book called The 1,000-Mile War, which meant the whole length of the Aleutians. And that he recognized that the Japanese evacuated their troops on the far side of the Kiska and Atu so that in submarines. So that was the reason when the troops went aboard, our troops went ashore, there were no Japanese left there. And I have a copy of that book. Now, from that operation, we had fired so many rounds that our 14-inch guns needed to be rebored. So we were ordered back to Bremerton, Washington, which is the home port of our ship. When we were there, we were given leave. I invited my future wife to come to Bremerton and to continue to develop a relationship. And interestingly, at least to me, to the Officers Club in Bremerton, and they had a bowling alley. That gave us an opportunity to do some bowling, and my future wife said, how about if we bowl the next 3 rounds, and whoever wins 2 out of 3 gets the opportunity to decide whether we're going to get engaged or just continue as we are. She had, in general, never beaten me in bowling, but fate entered into it, and she won 2 out of 3. She said, we're going to get engaged. And I said, I think that's crazy. You don't know what happened being in the war. She said, well, I'm prepared to take a risk. So, having won 2 out of 3 was her decision. We had, when we had leave, and so we went back to Chicago and had an engagement party at her brother and sister-in-law. Their name was Jerry Debs and Ruth Debs. Now, getting back, and then about another couple weeks after the ships were upgraded, we went back to Bremerton every 10 to 12 months for upgrading of equipment and bringing the equipment up to the best level. Then we were ordered to Treasure Island off San Francisco, and then given orders to go to the South Pacific and to support the landings of the troops on the various islands. My recollection is that the first one was Kwajalein and Iquitos, and what our position was to support troops landing on the island, which was a theory or a practice of General Douglas MacArthur. His theory was to take an island and skip one, isolating the Japanese on the island that was skipped. So from there, we then went to Guam, where we supported operations to take back Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. After that operation which was a very intense effort, in my opinion, we put so many shells on Guam that we thought it would sink. However, many years later, it has become a location to go for people to go on vacation. the Japanese developed caves so that they were protected, and some of the people were even still in those areas many years later. After the completion of that operation, the command gave us orders to go down to Australia for leave and recreation. Excuse me.
Sure.
Oh.
How do you think we're doing?
Doing good.
Doing well, doing very well. You can continue when you want to.
In Australia, as we approached Sydney, our topside personnel were all male, and our signal corps communicated with the troops on Sydney Harbor, who were all female, since the males were in service. That meant that all of our topside personnel had dates by the time we went ashore. When we landed in Sydney, the officers were invited to a club and introduced the young ladies for them to go wherever while we're on leave. We were there for several days and then ordered to Brisbane for leave and recreation. After that, we were to return to our battleship division. And I think this was in preparation for other landings. One incident situation, our battleships which were escorted by destroyers our battleships had two planes each. They flew during the day to be prepared for any possibility of Japanese being in the area, but of course there weren't any. The planes are returned to the ships by the ship making a 180-degree turn, which provides a swale in the water, which is usually smooth enough for the plane to get in the water, and then the ships have derricks to pick the planes up. However, we lost both the planes, but not the to the Philippines. The first area was in Leyte Gulf, Leyte, where there had been a pretty intense operation, but when that was secured, maybe a month or so later, we prepared to go up north to the island of Mindoro. Now, I didn't realize that the film leads really include 19 islands. And the operation on Mindoro was secured, and we went back to Leyte Gulf. And then we were ordered to go up to the Guyot Gulf, which is the Gulf that is adjacent to the island of Luzon. Luzon leads up to the capital of Manila. Our orders were to, for our group, to go up to Leyte Gulf and support the troops which were to evacuate or remove the Japanese troops. The initial arrangement was ordered, the original orders were to go into the Guyot Gulf at dawn. For some reason, the admiral in charge of this operation ordered the ships to go past the Guyot, perhaps that might deceive the Japanese in thinking that we were going up toward Tokyo. However, we were then, as we got past a little bit, maybe 100 or so miles, we were returning to the Guyot Gulf. And about noon on January 5th, 1945, as we were entering the Guyot Gulf again, we were targeted by a kamikaze bomber. We had never been targeted per se before, except that the planes did come across us. In this connection, my brother, Burton Sobel, and my cousin, Arnold Sobel, were skippers of LSTs, that's landing ship tank. And they were in this operation. There were probably 500 ships in this. At that point, I didn't really realize how much an operation, how many ships an operation required. As a matter of fact, also, before you go into an operation, there are tankers that come across to make sure that fuel is adequate to go through the operation. Anyway, at noon on January 5th, 1945, we were targeted by this kamikaze plane. And our ship's photographer took a picture of that, and we might find that to include in whatever you want to put into this story. As I mentioned, our ship's photographer took a picture of that plane coming in. When communication notified us that the plane was targeting us, it was, as officer of the deck, I wasn't sure that I had the authority to reposition the ship so that possibly the kamikaze would not hit it. The captain's position is on the port wing. The wing is a platform that extends out at 20 feet from the bridge, and on the east portion, or the right starboard portion, is the gunnery officer. On the bridge with me were the two quartermasters and the helmsman, and behind our bridge position were communications, especially the officer who keeps a recognition of whatever the situation is. As I hailed the captain to see if we could do something, and I was just at the door to the bridge on the port side, and the captain was coming in response to my request. When the kamikaze bomber came through and landed on the forward part of the ship. Mm-hmm. And these bombers have 500-pound bombs. That bomb, of course, exploded and sent percussion and shrapnel in many areas. When that bomb exploded, the captain was killed, Captain Robert Fleming, and I was wounded. I got shrapnel in my left eye, which has now a very limited vision. Also, being the flagship, our ship, USS New Mexico, was where the Admiral was located. The Admiral's Bridge is just below the Captain's Bridge, and there were observers. One, the observer for Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and an observer Lieutenant General observing for the Canadian forces, and the Time correspondent, Robert Chickering. All three were killed. Of course, I was taken off the bridge and taken down to sick bay. Sick bay is maybe 7 stories below the bridge, and it also underneath the big guns on the forward, the 2 forward turrets. I had no consciousness for probably an hour. When I woke up finally in sick bay, I was all cleaned up and stay in the sick bay. The operation took approximately 6 days, and our ships fired the guns from dawn to dusk. The government did not recognize the personnel other than those on the top side required earplugs. And for that reason, I have to have 2 hearing aids and a device which moderates or increases the volume. After the operation was secured, we were transported across to ships, which would take our ships, take us to the Guyan Gulf, where they were just transports, and we were taken down to Lady Gulf, where we were transferred to the hospital ship Hope. Hospital ships sailed at all times, fully illuminated. And then we were taken from Lady Gulf to the Naval Hospital in the Admiralty Islands. In there, I was treated by a psychologist to try to eliminate in my mind the guilt that I had been responsible for the killing of almost 30 officers and men and over 80 wounded. And I carry that concern for all my life. Going back, after I was taken off the ship at probably very early in the morning, my brother Burton was in that operation, and he came aboard our ship to see me. And of course I was not there. That was the closest we ever were in all the years, 2, 3, while we were in that operation. My brother and my cousin were skippers of the LST in the Admiralty Island. I spent every day talking to a psychologist or psychiatrist to try to help me rationalize that I really didn't have any reason to be concerned. While our USS of Mexico has an association, and they have a reunion every year. I've been to some of them, and at one time we were in Mobile, Alabama. The USS Alabama, which was a very new ship, was in the harbor. We had hoped to go aboard, but it was just after they had the very heavy storms, and so it wasn't possible to get there, but we got to see it. My daughter had met me in Mobile, and she did get aboard. Going back to that gathering, one of our shipmates, John Driscoll, was making tapes for all the people he could find that had been in that operation. John Driscoll interviewed, and at that time, one of the quartermasters came to a location where I was sitting with my daughter and said, I'm sure glad to see you, because the last time I saw you, you were covered with blood. Take a break.
Sure. You can continue when you want to. Take as long as you need.
I didn't hear you.
You can take as long a break as you need to. And when you're ready, you can start.
Okay. After, during the 7 months, or several months, while I was in the hospital at the Admiralty Islands, and meeting every day for several hours with the psychologist. It happened to be over a Passover, and that's when there is what's called a Seder. And while there were a number of Jewish personnel, almost everybody, all of the others who were also in that hospital came to the dinner, which is called a Seder, and by great coincidence, the rabbi of the temple in Glencoe, which my wife and I attended, was the rabbi that presided over that service. they, but maybe a month or so later, I was considered suitable, my condition was suitable to be returned to the States. We were taken on a troop transport from the Admiral Islands to Treasure Island in just off San Francisco. I had arranged with my wife, who I should go back. While I was recovering, again, we were in an officers club, and she said, I think we should get married. Again, I argued with it, but she won 2 of the 3 games, so we got married. I had arranged, we had told her when we expected to land, and we had arranged to meet at the St. Francis Hotel. And when we were to go ashore, the captain said that we all had to be in dress uniform. Now, I didn't have any clothes except my khakis. So I had to borrow a jacket, which was a little big for me, and didn't have a belt. So I had to use, they give you a rope to tie around it. So as I was getting back to St. Francis, my wife was talking to some other officers, motioned to me to meet at the side door. And that's what we did. And we were only there a couple of days when we were given orders for me to go back to Great Lakes Hospital. My orders were to be in the hospital during the week and to have weekends with my wife and family. During this period of recovery, again, I was seeing a psychologist. I was finally given orders to go back on active duty, and I was recovering or completing my recovery while I was back at home. One interesting interest in my mind is that I thought it would be nice if, well, my mother and father and my wife and I would have lunch at the Edgewater Beach Hotel, which at that time was at the edge of the water. Time out. As you all probably know, the Edgewater Beach was really at the edge of the water. And I was dressed in my white, and I cut into a piece of meat, probably a steak, and the blood splattered all over my uniform. My mother was desolated. My wife just chuckled, took a wet napkin and wiped it off because the starch in the shirt kept it from absorbing any of it. Shortly thereafter, I was ordered to be a navigator on a supply ship. But the war in China and Japan terminated, and I had an adequate number of points to be discharged. So we went back to Chicago, of course, and we maybe a month later, I developed what was called hypothyroidism, and that gave me a condition where I was so weak I couldn't get out of bed. So I was taken to what was then Wesley Hospital, which is now no longer there because the hospital Northwestern has absorbed all of that. By great good fortune, a doctor had experimented with a drug called thiouracil, and he gave me that for several days, and I began to get my mobility back. Now, to finish the story, after I recovered, I restarted my architectural practice. Now, I had worked from after graduation. I was introduced to an architect, Ernst Banker, when in my senior year. I really had 5 years in college because the dean didn't give me credit for the time I spent at Northwestern. So I restarted my practice, and I'll go back. This is approximately 1935. And so I had the 5th year that was then Armor Institute, is now Illinois Institute of Technology. And I was what was called a TA, teaching assistant. One professor, these professors had been invited by Armor. They were professors at Northwestern. They were invited to teach social science, the first non-architectural curriculum that had been at Armor. So the one professor was building a house in Evanston, and the other, who later became the chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, each discussed what project might be adequate or interesting. The professor who professor was Professor Blau. He became the chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The other, Mr. Barrelsheimer, Professor Barrelsheimer, was building his house in Evanston. And he suggested that I come out to the building and he would introduce me to the architect. I think we met on a Saturday. And as we were leaving, Professor Barrelsheimer said, "What do you think you'll do when you graduate?" He said, the architect, Ernst Banker, "What do you think you'll be doing when you graduate?" I said, "Well, I better look for a job." He said, "That's a good idea. I can't promise anything, but when you graduate, give me a call and I'll see what the situation is." The other professor had a property in Virginia and expected that someday he would like to restore it. So I was given that project to do a preservation project. So going back to architect Ernst Banker, when I graduated, I called him. He seemed surprised, but he said, "Come to my office." Office was in Winnetka. And I'll see how the situation is. And he said, "Before you do that, you have to explain to your mother and father that we don't pay interns." So I talked it over with my mother and father. And my father said, "If you think he can teach you something and you can learn, do it." That began approximately 2.5 years of very interesting experience. Ernst Banker theory was to make it as efficient as it was possible. And I worked on several projects with him. One of the first he gave me was to design a fireplace with a chimney and all in place. And then one of his clients, people that lived in Winnetka, had a farm in Elbert, Illinois. And they wanted a 50-car barn. So Mr. Baker told me, "Do what you think it should be, but you have to use the concrete block, which I developed." He developed an oversized concrete block by putting pneumatic tubes into it, which he inflated and poured the lightweight concrete around it, so the larger block was not much heavier than a standard block. Now, my reason for explaining this is that when I worked for Mr. Baker, he had 2 children, Ernst Jr. and Kyle. One was maybe 5 years old, the other 7. About 6-7 years ago, I was returning from a trip with my son and his wife, and we came through Palatine, and there was a sign which said developer or tile maker. That gave me the opportunity to reconnect with him, and we continued to develop information together. When I finished, maybe 2.5 years after I started to work for Mr. Baker, he decided that he and his family were to go back to Germany so that they could meet with his parents. And I was put in charge of the office. And when he returned, there was not much new work. So he said, "I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to let you go." At that time, he owed me some money, and he said, "I'll pay you as quickly as I can." Another interesting coincidence. In this period when I was waiting for Mr. Baker to come back, there was a contractor who worked for us and worked for and been working with John Van Bergen. And he told me that he thought I should contact Mr. Van Bergen because he'd been commissioned to design additions to 3 schools in Highland Park and build a new one. And Mr. Van Bergen gave me the job to work on the 3 addition and remodeling, and he did the new one. The reason I'm explaining this part is that I keep in contact with the teacher, the principal, and the children in this teacher's special 5th grade class. And in the last couple of years, I've given them questionnaires to see whether the building is on the edge of a ravine, and the portion which I designed was a 2-story addition, partly in the ravine. So I asked the children, how do you think that position adjacent to the ravine and the school is very prairie style, mostly 1 story. Classrooms have pitch ceilings, they have windows all along one side, which gives the room daylight. The questionnaires are whether that experience of being in a classroom with lovely daylight, and part of in that 2-story addition which I designed, the lower level is for the cafeteria, and after that for meeting rooms, and the upper level is a gymnasium and convertible to an auditorium. And so I asked them whether the questionnaire asked, does this position as it style of the building encourage you to think about architecture, the environment, and and how it is, who the architect was, and do you think that you are better students because you are educated in this atmosphere? And I think that's pretty much the whole story.
Well, I thank you. I would like
Do
to.
you think that I'm going on too long about things that are not related to my Navy service? But what I wanted to point out was, because I was teaching recognition of ships and planes, that began my career of teaching. When I returned to my practice, I developed the refresher course for students that were preparing for a state board exam. Subsequently, a Professor George Shipwright, asked me to develop a program, architectural programming, conceptual planning, and design. And shortly thereafter, we presented that to the accreditation board, and it was accredited. I taught that from 1985 to 2003. At that time, I had two assistants, my associates, who assisted because we had classes of 60 or more. Mm-hmm. Take a break.
Mr. Sobel, I would like to talk about the other two pictures over here.
Yes.
If we could show those and you could explain what those are.
Sure.
Okay. Let's do this first. The original picture.
That is what the New Mexico, how it was originally designed in 1918 when it was launched. Mm-hmm. If you notice, that's a lattice mass that was converted many times, and every 10 to 12 months we came back and forth and upgrading. So the ship was much different, and we have a picture of it as it is now.
Now, did you draw that picture, or did you draw that picture? Are you the artist for that?
That's a lattice mass.
Right.
Yeah, she's asking if you draw the picture.
Well, I didn't draw that,
Okay.
no.
Okay.
But I do have watercolors of the ship that I did when I was on the ship. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this is what the ship looks like.
You want to bring it a little closer?
I have a model of the ship, which every year at the USS New Mexico meeting, mm-hmm. There's a raffle for a model of the ship. Mm-hmm. And 1 year I won the model, and my son Richard won a small piece, a small replica. And of course that too big to carry here, but we can give you some pictures
Thank you.
if that's of interest.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for holding that up.
You're welcome.
And what are the two boxes that you have here?
These are the medals.
Oh, these are the medals that were awarded to me for the operations.
Mm-hmm.
There were approximately
Right here.
7 medals,
You just hold it back right here.
including the one
Right by him.
in the
That's
for
good.
the operations in the Philippines.
Okay, so that was for the Philippines.
Talk about your Purple Heart.
Hmm.
Talk about your Purple Heart medal.
Oh yes, because I was wounded,
Mm-hmm.
I got the Purple Heart.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody said they're glad to get it, but they wouldn't take $1 million to go through what they did.
Right.
But recovery and reflecting on this is one of the heartwarming situations, but it also makes me recognize that all the support that the VA provides, we are responsible to give back to our families and friends a recognition of what we went through and how fortunate we are to recover. In that connection, when I was recovering, I repeated the 23rd Psalm, which abbreviated is, "The Lord is my shepherd. He leads me through green fields, along the silent waters. My rod and my staff shall join me, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. I shall fear no evil."
Thank you.
And final note, I think veterans are fortunate that the VA recognizes their needs. And I think that if the general public were aware of the cost to the government and the families of the survivors, we would never have another war.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Walter Sobel, for sharing your story. It's been a wonderful afternoon listening to you, and I thank you very much.